like, why? Why did this even have to happen? It makes no sense, because I'm just waiting for something to happen, for some new information to come out that's going to explain why this happened. And I'll be like, oh, okay, that makes sense. And then I can let it go. But so far, there's nothing. There's nothing. She was just mad that people liked her book, but not enough, I guess. Or not in the exact way in which she expected her book to be liked by each and every human being on the planet. I don't even know. Hey friends, Elizabeth here from Plant-Based Bride, back again with another video. And today I'm going to chat with you about the books I read in April, give little mini reviews, ratings, my thoughts, and just hang out for a bit. It's a super gray, rainy day here in Toronto today. It's making me feel very zen, ready to curl up with a book that I started in April and did not finish, of which there are many. So I thought today would be the perfect day to chat about books and just hang out a little bit. So a little summary, I guess, of April. I 100% went through a reading slump in April. I really struggled to pay attention to the books I was reading. I was really struggling not only with paying attention and just keeping focused on the words I was reading, but also connecting to the stories and caring about the characters. And sure, it's possible that some of that was the book's fault and just the books I was picking up. But because it was such an overwhelming feeling throughout the entire month, I do think that some of that was just me. I'm very stressed and overwhelmed right now, and I think it's just making it harder for me to really dive into a book and immerse myself. And then also, because of my reading slump, there were several books that I started that I was just working through at a much slower pace than usual, so I wasn't able to finish them in April. So some that come to mind are Hood Feminism, Disfigured, House of Leaves, Remains of the Day, We Are Not Free, Mermaid of Jeju. And I did make quite a bit of progress on some of those books, especially House of Leaves. I actually started House of Leaves back in October of 2020, and I could not get into it at the time, but I picked it up again this month, and I actually read a chapter a day for about the first half of the month, and I was really into it, and I still want to spend time reading it, but I just feel like I don't have the time required because of where I've gotten to in the book. I'm at the point, if you've read it, then you know, where you need to have your mirror there because there's text written mirrored on the page and you have to read in your mirror. You have to flip it upside down. There are even more footnotes than before, which if you've read House of Leaves, you know there are already a lot. So it's just getting to the point where I need to kind of be in the right state of mind and be really focused to be able to commit to reading a chapter. And it does take quite a long time. So I kind of fell off, but I am going to keep reading House of Leaves because I am actually really, really enjoying it. But anyway, I'm not going to keep talking about House of Leaves because I didn't finish it, so that's not what this video is for. So for something different, I thought it would be fun this month to try doing stats at the beginning before I get into my reviews. Normally I leave my stats for after I finish my reviews and before I talk about my TBR or reading plans for the upcoming month. So this is something different. Let me know in the comments if you prefer my usual timing for the stats or if you like them at the beginning. So popping up on the screen now, my stats for reading in April. My page count is lower than usual because out of all the books that I started in April, the ones I finished tended to be the ones that were shorter. This month, I didn't read any middle grade or children's books. I read 77.8% adult books and 22.2% YA or young adult. As for genre, it was kind of cool to see how spread out my reads were this month. I read 2 mystery, 2 poetry, 1 contemporary, 1 magical realism, 1 romance, 1 science fiction, and 1 thriller. So pretty even across the board there, which is kind of interesting. As for format, again, because of my reading slump, a lot of the books that I was reading physically or in ebook form, I didn't manage to finish this month. And the books I had an easier time finishing were in audiobook form. So for that reason, 77.8% of the books I finished were audiobooks and 22.2% were ebooks. On to my ratings. As you can see, I had 0 1-star reads, which is not that surprising. I don't tend to rate a book 1 star unless I really hate it. I did sadly have 3 2-star reads though, which is not great. Then 2 3-star reads, 2 4-star reads, and 2 5-star reads. On to the LGBTQIA plus rep in the books that I read in April. 66.7% of the books I read this month didn't have any LGBTQIA plus rep, and 33.3% did have rep in some form. As for the year published for the books read this month, 4 of them were published this year in 2021, 3 were published in 2020, and then I have 1 from 2015 and 1 from 1994, both of which I read translations, which were published more recently, but the original works were published in 2015 and 1994. As for how I got the books that I read, most of them were from Libro FM this month. A lot of them were actually audio arcs that I got from Libro FM. And if you're not familiar with Libro FM, they allow you to get audiobooks while supporting small bookshops, which especially in our current climate is really important. So I love Libro FM, and they give me free influencer copies of a couple audiobooks a month in exchange for me talking about their service with all of you. So they're a really cool service. And I kind of used my slump this month to work through some of my influencer copies from past months that I hadn't got to yet. So 55.6% of my reads from Libro FM, 11.1% were owned, 11.1% borrowed, 11.1% from Scribd or Scribed, however you say it, and 11.1% from NetGalley as an ARC. 44.4% of the authors were white, 22.2% were Asian, and 33.3% were Black, and 88.9% female, and 11.1% male. And lastly, the author's nationality. 5 of the authors were American, 2 were from the UK, and 2 were Japanese. So those are my April stats. Again, let me know if you like them like this near the beginning of the video, or if you'd rather I put them back to their original location near the end. And now, without further ado, let's get into reviewing the books I read in April. So the first book I finished in April was The Wife Upstairs by Rachel Hawkins. And this is a thriller inspired by Jane Eyre, which I have not read, so I can't speak to how it is as kind of a retelling of a classic story, though I do want to read Jane Eyre eventually. And basically, our main character, Jane, is a dog walker in a very rich neighborhood, and she meets a recently widowed man and they fall in love. And then there's a bit of a question about his wife's death. Was it an accident? Was it not an accident? And if it wasn't, who was at fault? Ooh, mystery. So this book didn't really work for me. I gave it 2 stars. I didn't hate it, but it just wasn't particularly interesting. It was super predictable. From basically the first chapter, I could see where it was going, and I haven't even read Jane Eyre. I did see some reviews from people who have read Jane Eyre saying that the fact that they'd read the original meant that they could tell what was happening from the beginning. To be honest, even not knowing the source material, I could tell what was happening from the beginning. I think it was just very, very obviously written. There was no twist, really. And all the characters were just very unlikable, which seems to be a trend in thrillers that are being published recently, or maybe just the ones I'm picking up, the popular ones. But so many of them just have an entire cast of unlikable characters, none of which are at all redeemable. You can't kind of connect to any of them. And as with a lot of thrillers, I feel like I've read in the past year or two, you just don't know why anyone is doing anything. It's really frustrating to me. So this just wasn't for me. I was also sad that in the description on Goodreads, it was talking about how this kind of had a gothic atmosphere, and there was no gothic atmosphere. There was actually just no atmosphere whatsoever. It wasn't eerie or creepy. There wasn't much going on here, so I would not recommend. The next book I finished in April was Act Your Age, Eve Brown by Talia Hibbert, and this is the 3rd book in the Brown Sisters trilogy, which is a series of romance stories focusing on these Brown sisters, and Eve is the youngest of the 3, and I loved this as much as I loved the first and second installments. I think I've given each of these books 4 stars, and it's probably more like 4.5 or a very high 4-star. I mean, a star rating system is so limited anyway, but I feel like I try to reserve my 5 stars for books that really do something interesting that kind of surprises me or really catches my attention, because they're just doing something new or tackling something that's been done in a really unique way. Or if I just adore them and, I want to shout it from the rooftops, favorite of all time sort of status. So even though I really liked all 3 of these, they just were still pretty formulaic romances. They're not doing anything groundbreaking, but they're really nice and they're quite steamy, and the characters are quite well developed, and each story has a variety of representation. And from what I can tell from reading Own Voices reviewers, the representation has been done very well. And part of that, I think, is that both in the first book, where Chloe, the protagonist, has fibromyalgia, and in this 3rd book, where there is autistic rep, the author herself, Talia Hibbert, has fibromyalgia and is also autistic. So it's coming from her own experience, their own voices novels. I don't know if that applies to the second book. I don't know if Talia Hibbert is bisexual like Danny, or if she deals with PTSD or anxiety like Zafir. I'm not sure about that. If you know, let me know in the comments. If I remember, I'm going to look this up after the video because I'm curious. But I really appreciate how Talia Hibbert approaches representation. She seems to really put a lot of effort into making that representation accurate and positive. And I know one of my patrons actually has fibromyalgia, and she said that she loved the first book in the series and that it was such good representation of what it's like to have a chronic illness and to have fibromyalgia specifically. So I just love to hear that. And this third book is really, really great. I could relate to Eve on many levels, even though I would say some of our basic personality traits are not very similar. A lot of her interests and a lot of her sort of wounds, not trauma per se, but just things she's gone through, resonated with me very closely and mirrored my own life. So I had some moments that really hit me hard and left me kind of a sobbing mess, which, to be honest, is not that hard to do because I cry very easily, but I really related to Eve. I really liked her and I enjoyed the book. It was very steamy, very sweet. I liked the love interest. It was fun. I would recommend it. Oh, I didn't give a summary. Basically, Eve is cut off by her parents and told to grow up. And she is looking for a job. She's looking for a way to support herself now that she's not going to be living at home, supported by her parents. And after a sequence of unfortunate or fortunate, depending on how you look at it, events, she ends up with a job at a little B&B with a grumpy but lovable owner, and romance ensues. The next book I finished in April was Sasha, Masha by Agnes Borinsky. And this is the story of Sasha Masha, who is a teen coming to terms with who they really are and figuring out their own gender identity and gender expression. I enjoyed this. I gave it 4 stars. It really demonstrates how it can be so hard to figure out who you are and to define that for yourself if you don't even know it's possible, if you don't have that representation, if you don't have access to a variety of communities, if you don't know something exists, it's hard to identify as it, essentially. And I thought this story was really beautifully written and really well done. It is an own voices story. The author herself is trans. And it just had a lot of heart, and I could really feel for Sasha Masha as she came to terms with who she really is and found people who could aid her in that journey and support her in that journey. Really, the only drawbacks for me when it comes to this one is that it is quite short, so at times it does feel a little underdeveloped. Some of the characters are not as fleshed out as I might like, and the plot is pretty simplistic. But it's really not about the plot. It is so much about Sasha Masha's internal discovery of herself. And I think for that, it is so valuable. And it really was very heartwarming to read. The next book I finished in April was The Windsor Knot by S.J. Bennet. The Windsor Knot really caught my attention when I saw it on NetGalley because it is a murder mystery, a cozy mystery where the Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth II herself, is the investigator, which just seems so silly and absolutely charming. So I thought, you know what? I want to read you. And honestly, it delivered what I was expecting. It was a very cozy mystery, perfect for a day like today, which is a super rainy, cuddle up under a blanket, sip a cup of tea, cuddle with your cat, and read something that is intriguing and kind of funny and fun and mysterious, but not too intense, not too dark, and has a generally happy ending outside of the victims of the crime. I really liked the Queen's assistant, Rosie. I found her to be a really interesting character, and I found the characterization of the Queen quite interesting and quite charming. But I will say that it was a little strange to read a book centered around real people who are currently alive. And it was especially odd with the timing of when I actually was reading this month, because Prince Philip died right as I was reading it. And it was very strange to read the Queen and Philip having their sort of cute married banter, knowing that he had just passed away, and it felt kind of uncomfortable. And there were also some references to her grandchildren and talking about Harry, who at the time that this novel was written had not yet met and married Meghan, so she's not mentioned in the book. But there was just some weirdness around that as well with the recent Oprah interview and the way that Harry and Meghan have been treated by the media and by the royal family. So I guess that's just kind of a drawback that comes with writing a fictional story about real life people who exist and are very famous and might be in the news when someone is reading your book. So I guess take that with a grain of salt. If you're into the royals, if this sounds like something that you would like, then I think you will enjoy it. I think it is very solid and delivers kind of what you expect from it. If you're not particularly into the royals, or if you think you would be uncomfortable reading about them in this way, then I would maybe skip it. It also doesn't have the most satisfying resolution ever. It was okay. It didn't have a big twist that was shocking, and it didn't sort of have a payoff that was really satisfying either. It just kind of ended, and it was fine. Though I will say that the sort of postscript wrap-up was very emotional and made me cry and was very sweet. So overall, I enjoyed this. I think it's great for a rainy afternoon if you're looking for something to read, a cozy mystery. It's kind of fun, but again, kind of strange to read about real life, currently living people as fictional characters, solving mysteries and the like. The next book I read in April was Before the Coffee Gets Cold by Toshikazu Kawaguchi. Before the Coffee Gets Cold is a magical realism story set in Japan where this small coffee shop has one special chair where if you do things just right, you can travel back or forward in time for just the length of time it takes for your coffee to get cold. And it allows people to visit a loved one they've lost or say something that they never got the chance to say. And this was a really intriguing concept to me. It was actually recommended to me by one of you, saying that it was one of your favorite reads of last year. So I went into it with high expectations. And I will say that the writing style was really, really tough for me to get through. And I don't know how much of that is the original writing style and, differences in Japanese and English literature in the type of writing that is popular, and how much of it maybe comes from the translator themselves or just the act of being translated. There's a reason why the saying lost in translation is so ubiquitous. So I'm not really sure where that came from, but I will say that the writing style was hard for me. And I thought about DNFing for the first 60% or so, I will say. It was very repetitive. The characters were described in great detail as far as the clothes they were wearing and the color of their handbag, but not a lot was shared about their mannerisms or the way they carried themselves or the tone of their voice or anything that could really give us a feel for a person. It was sort of, they have short black hair and they wear a pink sweater with a green tank top that has a flower on it and brown shorts that have 2 pockets in the front and 3 on the back, and have a cuff turned up twice with green striped socks that come just below the knee and white sneakers with laces that are slightly dirty from the dust outside and purple soles that have imprints of flowers on them. Like that, those kinds of descriptions that kind of go on forever, but don't tell you much about the person other than what they are currently wearing. There were also a few times where we were regaled with receipts and heard every single item on the receipt as well as the amount. And then we were told exactly how much was paid, the exact change, and how much change was given back, and the exact coins in which it was paid back, which was just, a little tedious, not something that really added anything to the story, but different strokes for different folks. I think some people would probably really like this, just like I know that there are some types of writing styles that I really enjoy that other people cannot stand. But I will say that after about the 50% mark, I started to get a lot more used to the writing style, and also some of the excessive repetition from the first half dissipated. But also I will say that the emotions involved and the character development really ramped up in the second half, and the last 2 stories were absolutely heart-wrenching and made me cry quite a bit and were very touching. So even though I struggled with this one and I almost put it down so many times, I am glad I finished it. Would I recommend it to anyone to read? Maybe, maybe not. It really depends on if you're willing to put in the work in the first half to get to the second half. But I will say that I am happy I read it. I enjoyed those last 2 stories. They were really beautiful, and I found myself thinking about them from time to time. So it's sort of a mixed bag. And that's why I gave it 3 stars. I feel like the first half for me was basically a 1 star, unfortunately, but the second half was easily a 4 or 5 star. So 3 stars it is, I guess. I don't know. Ratings don't really mean anything anyway, but there it is. The next book I finished in April was They Wish They Were Us by Jessica Goodman. And this is a young adult thriller focused on privileged kids who go to a private high school and are in an exclusive clique that gives them access to everything they need to have a successful post-secondary career and life moving forward. But their group has been touched by tragedy, and this story follows our protagonist as she tries to discover the truth of her best friend's death. So this is another one that didn't work for me. Sadly, I gave it 2 stars. It was billed as Gossip Girl-esque, and yes, in some ways it was. I guess they are privileged kids. There's a lot of cliquiness going on. There is bullying, but it didn't really deliver the heart of Gossip Girl or the characters that you can root for, even as you recognize that they are incredibly flawed and privileged. Again, this was similar to The Wife Upstairs. Every single character was unlikable. Not one was redeemable, in my opinion. It was really hard to care about or root for any of them, because even the characters that we are clearly supposed to get behind or be rooting for or relating to are doing really awful things to other people. And there's a lot of hazing and bullying and awfulness going on within this group. And it just wasn't very enjoyable to read, I gotta say. And the worst thing, in my opinion, for pretty much any mystery or thriller, it was very, very predictable. I figured out within the first couple chapters who the killer was and also who we were going to be tricked into thinking the killer was before the big shocking twist, the red herring, as it were. And that's no fun to figure it out that early. Maybe this would be more shocking or exciting for a young adult reader. I try to acknowledge when I read young adult that I am not the target audience, and therefore try to be a little less harsh in my critique because, again, I'm not the target audience. But I feel like even me as a teenager could have figured this out in an instant. I think teenagers would see what's coming as well, more than likely. So didn't work for me, sadly. I was excited for that dark academia, cliquey high school mystery read, which is a, subgenre that I've enjoyed since I was in high school. But this one just kind of missed the mark for me, sadly. The next book I finished in April was our book club pick, which was The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa. This story follows our unnamed protagonist as she lives on an island where slowly more and more items are disappearing, and the memory police enforce those disappearances, from roses to photographs to birds to calendars. Each disappearance impacts the people of the island in new ways, and we follow our protagonist as she deals with the loss of these things throughout her life. Now, I want to preface this by saying that I only finished this yesterday, and it has some really complex ideas, so I'm still processing. It's still percolating, and our discussion is on Saturday, and I'm really excited to talk about this because there are so many ways to interpret this story, what's really happening, and also what the author is trying to say. So I'm very excited for that. But I will say, first of all, I gave this book 5 stars because I enjoyed the process of reading it. I was very immersed. I really liked the writing style. I liked the book within a book. And I found it incredibly thought-provoking. And I'm really enjoying thinking about different theories of what it could mean and researching things and diving deeper. And to me, that is a 5-star read. So I really, really liked this one, but I will say that I think how the translation is being marketed, because this book was written in 1994 and was just recently translated and published in English, being marketed as a sci-fi dystopian novel, but that's not really what it is. I would say it reads a lot more like a fable or a fairy tale. It's a cautionary tale. It is very dreamlike and hazy. It reads more like magical realism than sci-fi. While I love sci-fi, I also love lots of different types of books. So I think maybe for that reason, I wasn't so bothered that it ended up not really being sci-fi. But I think if you went into this expecting sci-fi and looking for that genre, looking for those scientific explanations for everything, that's not what you're going to get at all. And I think that's where some of the disconnect is coming from for people who read this book based on the marketing of the English version. And I don't know how it was marketed in Japan in 1994, but I certainly think that the marketing right now doesn't make much sense for what the book actually is. And this is kind of a hard book to talk about without spoilers, to be honest, but I will say it is incredibly thought-provoking. It really brings up some interesting questions about perception, the mind, memory, loss, conformity, and identity, and so much more. The story within a story was, well, I don't know if I'd say it's my favorite part, because I really liked the main storyline as well, but story within a story was so incredibly eerie and honestly terrifying in a very gradual way that sort of creeps up on you and makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. It went in a completely different direction than what I was expecting, and it was absolutely horrifying, but in such a unique way. It doesn't rely on traditional horror tropes. It's very psychological and very haunting, I guess, is how I would describe it. I really, really liked the book within a book. I would totally read that as a separate novel. If it was expanded, I think it would be amazing. And it was really interesting to see how that book within a book mirrored the main storyline, and how the typist in the book within a book mirrored and contrasted the protagonist in the main storyline, the novelist who is writing this story, and how the key romantic relationship in the story that the novelist is writing acts as essentially a foil to her own romantic relationship. There are so many layers to this, and it's really, really interesting. And again, I think one of my favorite things is that there are about 1 million ways to interpret what's happening here. And I love that. I love a book that lets me sort of dive in head first and come up with lots of different theories about what could be happening. I think if it's not done well, it can be super frustrating. And I'm sure that some people in reading this felt frustrated by the ending, but I think it was just done so well and in such a way that it just made me excited to try to come up with the best theory to fit this, and to talk to other people about what could be happening and analyze it and tear it apart and put it back together again. And I can definitely see myself rereading this after we've had our discussion and maybe a little bit of time to continue to let it percolate. And to me, that is the sign of a really interesting work. So if all of that I just spewed out at you about the Memory Police sounds interesting, I would highly recommend it. If this sounds like your worst nightmare, then I would steer clear, because you probably won't enjoy it. But I think for the right reader, you will be just as sucked in and fascinated by this story as I was. The next book I finished in April was All Along You Were Blooming by Morgan Harper Nichols. And this is a poetry collection written by the famous Instagram artist and poet Morgan Harper Nichols, often known as just her initials, MHN. And I've been following her work for a very long time. I really, really enjoy how she combines art and very simple affirmations or short phrases or snippets of poetry to create a very atmospheric and comforting presence on the internet. I really appreciate what she does. But sadly, this poetry collection was not at all what I expected and was not for me. And honestly, I'm very sad to say that, because I've been such a big fan of her work for a really long time. But I do think I have identified where this kind of deviated from my expectations and why it didn't work for me. So I'm going to share those things so it can help you hopefully determine if this is something worth your time or not. So the first thing I will say is that I initially started listening to this via audiobook because I had a influencer copy from Libro FM, and I quickly realized that I could not listen to this as an audiobook. It is narrated by the author, but it's just very hard to follow the poetry listening to it. At least it was for me. And it does seem in reading reviews that a lot of other people felt the same. So after the first, honestly, maybe 5 minutes, I switched over to the ebook version to try to read it. And that was definitely easier, but still not ideal. And from what I can tell, the printed version has a lot of her art combined, and it's a lot more similar to what she posts on Instagram than the ebook, which had a couple images, but for the most part was just the text on its own. And I really don't think that this work works in any format other than the physical copy that is the art combined with the words. I think it loses a lot just being text on a screen, and it loses even more being read as an audiobook. So I will say that I think the format makes a big difference. I honestly don't think this should have even been released as an ebook or audiobook, or at least not as an ebook if it wasn't going to be released as all of the images that are included in the physical version. So that's kind of the first part. I think that if you're going to read this, get it in a hard copy. Otherwise, I would not recommend. Then the next thing I will say is, well, first of all, I'm not an expert on poetry. I don't read a huge amount of poetry, but I do like some poetry that I've read, including the next thing I'm going to talk about, the last book I read in April. But personally, in my own non-expert opinion, Morgan Harper Nichols' writing is a lot more suited to the short, pithy, shareable snippets that she posts on Instagram than it is to a long-form book. It seems like she extended what she normally shares on Instagram over several slides into longer pieces, longer poems. And I feel that they lost something in that expansion. It didn't feel like that added more depth, more complexity, or more beauty. It just felt that they were more repetitive and that there was more empty space. Now, again, that's just my personal opinion. I'm not an expert. I don't know, maybe someone else who knows more about poetry would completely disagree, but I much prefer to read the work that she posts on Instagram than I enjoyed reading any singular poem in this collection. That being said, there were a couple poems that resonated with me that I did like, but I was shocked by how few there really were. I would say out of the whole book, maybe 10% resonated with me, which honestly shocked me because, again, I haven't read everything that Morgan Harper Nichols has ever posted on Instagram, but I feel like every time I see one of her posts, I'm saving it and I'm really resonating with it. So I was really shocked by how many of these poems I felt completely disconnected from. And part of that is a lot of times what she's doing on Instagram doesn't feel so much like poetry as self-help or affirmations. Really, I would say affirmations is probably the most accurate way to describe what she posts on Instagram. And I love affirmations and I love the way that she words them and illustrates them, but I wouldn't necessarily call them poetry. And I think in the process of trying to turn them into poetry, they kind of lost their magic. The last thing for me that was an issue with this is that up until I started reading this book, I had no idea that Morgan Harper Nichols is religious, which is fine. Lots of people are. I am not personally, but I don't care, to be honest, if anyone is religious. But I don't love to read work that is heavily religious. It just doesn't resonate with me. And this collection was heavily religious in a way that really surprised me and in a way that I just had not seen in her work before. Many of the poems are focused on the concept of grace within a religious context. There are mentions of specific books in the Bible. There are many mentions of light with a capital L. Almost every poem felt pretty heavily religious. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. I think a lot of people would feel that's a bonus to this collection, and that's awesome. But for me, as an atheist, it just added even more distance between myself and the poetry, added in another layer of disconnect there. And it was just a little off-putting, I think, and surprising. A lot of this book reads as a sermon in a way that her Instagram work just doesn't. Or maybe I just haven't noticed it before. I don't know. Maybe now when I look at her posts, I will pick up that religious undertone that I didn't notice before. But that was a big thing for me. Again, that could be a positive for someone out there, and that's awesome. If you really enjoy Morgan Harper Nichols' work and you happen to be Christian, or you don't mind reading work that has a heavy Christian undertone, then I would recommend you check it out. Again, with a caveat, only the physical copy, I believe, is really worth your time. And let me know what you think. But for those of us who would prefer to not read religious poetry, I would skip this one, sadly. I was really excited for this. And there are little snippets that I really loved, but they were really hard to find. That's very disappointing. The last book I finished in April actually isn't really a book. It is the audiobook version of the poem, The Hill We Climb, which Amanda Gorman performed at the inauguration of Joe Biden as the president of the United States, with a foreword by Oprah Winfrey, which was kind of fun. So this is literally just a performance of this poem by Amanda Gorman, and I saw that it was offered by Libro FM as an influencer ALC, and I immediately downloaded it because even though I'm not American, I watched the inauguration with my husband, and when Amanda Gorman started to speak, I was just absolutely entranced by her. I think she is an incredible young woman. She is mesmerizing. She really has such a powerful mastery over not only the words she uses, but the way that she performs those words, the way that she conveys meaning, both with her voice and her facial expressions, and the way she uses her hands was so artistic. And as a dancer, I really adored watching the way that she moved her hands as she talked. It was stunning. So I really wanted to listen to this again, and it did not disappoint, even without being able to see her beautiful hands and see her face with so much emotion. This was just stunning and very emotional. It made me cry when I watched it live during the inauguration, and it made me cry again when I listened to this audiobook version. And honestly, this is one of the most moving pieces of poetry that I have ever heard in my life. I think it is very poignant and very apt for the time that we are in right now. And even though I'm not American, it really stirs up some strong feelings in me. And I would highly recommend it, especially if you missed her performance at the inauguration. I'd recommend you find it somewhere on the internet and watch it. But I would also recommend this audiobook because it is just really, really beautiful to listen to. So those are all the books I read in April. Again, I had a bit of a weird reading month. I was in a bit of a reading slump, but I still managed to read quite a bit, and I did find a couple little gems. So hopefully you enjoyed watching this video. As always, please let me know in the comments if you've read any of these books and what your thoughts were. And if you have any recommendations for me, as always, leave them down below. I would love to check them out. As for my plans for reading in May, to be honest, the plan is I don't have a plan. This month is going to be absolutely ridiculous. I have so much pre-filming to do. We are 60 days out from moving across the country. There is so much to be done. I'm sure I'll listen to some audiobooks. I hope I will have some time to sit down and read some of the physical books that I have going, including House of Leaves. I really want to finish it. It's so good so far. But anyway, so we'll see. We'll see what happens. Hopefully I can finish some of the books that I have from the library that keep getting returned because I'm not finishing them fast enough. But I'm not going to set any expectations for myself because if I just make it through May alive, then it'll be a win, to be honest. So check back in next month to see what happened. I don't know why I'm doing that. Because who knows? Who knows what's going to happen? Also, before I go, just because I feel like I have to talk about this with fellow people who might know what's going on with this situation, can we just talk about authors being an absolute mess on the internet this past month? What the heck is in the water? What is going on? There are so many instances this month of authors just being so absolutely misguided in their actions that I couldn't even go through all of them if I tried. But I will say that the one instance that's really living in my mind rent-free is the whole Lauren Hough situation. This debut author with a huge following on Twitter decided to bitch about 4-star reviews, calling them nerds on a power trip. For 4-star reviews, like these are people reading her advanced reader copies who are really enjoying her work and giving it a good rating, and she called them out on Twitter and got really upset and called them all kinds of names. And then when people got upset, she doubled down and got even more rude and kept calling out more and more people. Honestly, I couldn't make this up if I tried. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, I would recommend checking out some videos that talk about the whole situation. I'll link Jess Owen's video down below because she's always very comprehensive with these situations. But honestly, it's just mind-boggling. She got so mad at people liking her book that she started this entire storm right before her book launch day, and now the rating for her book on Goodreads is this. honestly, it's just so baffling because the whole thing could have been prevented if she just hadn't been an asshole to people who actually liked her book and said as much. Like, why did this even happen? Why did it have to happen? Was it a PR stunt? Because if so, all it's done is make Lauren Hough or Hugh or whatever look like a total asshole. And I know I, for one, never want to read any of her work because who wants to read a book written by someone who is just so incredibly rude to their readers? But like, why? Why did this even have to happen? It makes no sense. This is why I can't get over it. And I keep watching more and more videos talking about the situation because I'm just waiting for something to happen, for some new information to come out that's going to explain why this happened. And I'll be like, oh, okay, that makes sense. And then I can let it go. But so far, there's nothing. There's nothing. She was just mad that people liked her book, but not enough, I guess. Or not in the exact way in which she expected her book to be liked by each and every human being on the planet. I don't even know. So anyway, those are my thoughts on that whole situation. Honestly, if you are aware of this and you have any thoughts, leave them down below. I just can't let it go because it makes no sense. Why did this even happen? The phrase nerd on a power trip is going to be my new favorite phrase. I think I'm going to take that on as an identity, as a mantle to wear with pride. Though I will say that all the people going to her Goodreads and rating her book 1 star that didn't read it, I don't condone that. I mean, not like anyone needs my permission, but I personally wouldn't do that. But I understand why people are doing it because she was being really awful to reviewers on Goodreads. But, you know, I don't think that that was necessary. And it seems like Goodreads is removing some of those reviews because they hadn't actually read the book and because the rating was based on the author and not the work itself, which is in their terms of service. But even though I don't necessarily agree with it, it is kind of funny because she was so exacting about needing it to be 5 stars. Otherwise, they were clearly haters. And the result is that her book has this rating now. So karma's a bitch, I guess. With that completely unrelated rant, that's the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Give it a like if you did. It helps me out in the algorithm. And I'll see you really soon in my next one. Bye, friends. Oh, before I go, I want to take a moment to thank my patrons for their support, because my patrons are the best. If you want to join us, feel free. There's a link in the card and in the description box down below. But really though, like, why did it even happen? I feel like the only theory that makes sense is that it was a PR stunt. I get that they say that any publicity is good publicity, but is it really though? Like, this whole thing just makes her look like such a mean person. I just don't understand. Why? Why, Lauren? Explain. Who hurt you? 4 stars is a good rating.